we will go ahead and get started there. Our meeting time was 2 o'clock, and we're already about 20 minutes after. Chairman Chanel is tied up in another meeting, and he will not be here at least during the first part of this meeting, but we want to go ahead and get started. We have got Jonathan Williams here with Alec to present to us some information that I think you all will find informative, and I think he's going to have maybe 25 or 30 minutes worth of a presentation, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some questions if any of the committee members have questions of him. So with that said, Jonathan, if you are almost ready, didn't mean to get ahead of you there.
Is that live there? All right.
So you want to go ahead, Jonathan, and get started, and then we'll catch up with the technology. The computers speed us right along, right?
Oh, no, that's all right. I can just do this. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for coming together today. It's a pleasure to be back in the state of Georgia. My name is Jonathan Williams, and I serve as Director of Tax and Fiscal Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council based in Washington, D.C. And for those of you that may not be familiar, we are the nation's largest nonpartisan membership organization of state legislators, with now 2,100 state legislators from all 50 states who come together that believe in the principles of good tax policy, and that's what we really work on, is helping states to develop both budget and tax reforms that will make themselves more competitive going forward. And it's a pleasure to be able to share with you some of our research, which is, we've been doing this for 4 years now, the Rich States, Poor States Project, with Arthur Laffer, who is Ronald Reagan's economic advisor from the 1980s, and also Stephen Moore from the Wall Street Journal. And we wanted to put together this project as a tool for legislators and policy advocates alike to really show what policies are working across what Justice Brandeis would call our 50 laboratories of democracy, so states can really see what policies to emulate and what policies to avoid. Now, if I were to have a 1-minute testimony, my short message to you would be more like Texas and less like California. We'll go through some of the examples from the Rich States, Poor States research that will help bear out how you make Georgia a more prosperous state through tax and budget reforms. I will say that this issue is a very personal issue to me. I come from a city of Saginaw, Michigan, which 50 years ago had a population of 100,000 people. Today has a population of 50,000 people. So the issue of providing real jobs and economic opportunities for everyone is a very important issue, and I've seen it firsthand, and how when you fail to create a hospitable business climate, then all of your graduates who you've been tried to do a good job educating through the K-12 system and through higher education, how they'll just leave the state in search of a job if you don't get the business climate right. And that's really one of the main principles that we talk about in Rich States, Poor States. And I think one of the things I'd like to start with is just by talking about the principles that we've developed. And I think these are generally accepted good tax policy principles from an academic framework, even across the ideological lines. I think, first of all, simplicity ought to be foremost when talking about tax policy. You shouldn't make it more difficult to collect the dollars you need for state government than it needs to be. Also, taxpayers, whether they're individual taxpayers or business taxpayers, probably shouldn't need a PhD from Harvard to figure out how to pay their taxes. Also, transparency. I think whether you're talking about budgets or whether you're talking about tax policy, really citizens deserve to know what type of taxing authorities have power over their income, or whether over their sales or over their property, and how much taxes are being extracted from them. And then neutrality is the third principle we like to talk about, and that is the principle that government should not be in the business of picking winners and losers. That's oftentimes very sensitive at the state level and at the federal level. Oftentimes governments do try to pick winners and losers, but the problem really that we see is that it doesn't often be very successful. If you were allowed people to pay by the same rules and treat everyone equally in terms of the tax code, then let the marketplace decide the winners and losers. And then the fourth principle we like to talk about is predictability, and that is when we work with businesses, and we work with many businesses across the country, and they're talking about the decision-making process that they go through when deciding what locations to use for their headquarters or even for new manufacturing or for startup facilities, they want to know that they're going to have a predictable system, that the rules of the game on tax policy are not going to change once they've made $1 million investment or $1 billion investment in a particular state. And then finally, I think the first four rules that we talked about here today are necessary but not sufficient conditions for good tax policy. The final principle, which I think is the most important, is the principle of competitiveness and pro-growth policy, is that you can have all the other attributes of good tax policy, but if you neglect the competitiveness aspect of it, we operate in basically what the founders set up for us as a 50-state free trade zone. And we have this very robust competition between the states today. There's really a war between the states, and that war is a war for human capital, it's a war for investment capital, it's a war for jobs and businesses. And I think that when you look at tax policy, always keeping that competitiveness angle in mind is very key. Keeping in mind the idea that when you change a tax policy, whether better or for worse, you're not doing it inside of a vacuum. It's going to immediately impact your position vis-a-vis your bordering neighboring states and versus states all across the country. One of the concepts that we talk about when it comes to competitiveness is keeping in mind that when your tax policies become uncompetitive, and for Georgia's sake, I mean, having 6% on corporate and individual income tax rates is not uncompetitive by the standards of California and New York. But judging yourself by those standards, any state's going to look pretty good. Judging yourself next to your neighbors in Florida and Tennessee without personal income tax, 6% versus 0 looks a whole lot different than 6%, of course, versus some of those high tax states. But the idea of if you allow your state tax system to become uncompetitive, you run into the concept of the Laffer curve, and that works against you. Now, if you remember from Economics 101, this is something that Arthur Laffer, my co-author on this book, allegedly came up with on a napkin at a bar one evening in the 1970s. And it's a concept that's really wasn't necessarily original, but the way he demonstrated it was. And his principle is at a 0% tax rate, you're going to raise zero amount of revenue based on that tax. That's the easy side of the Laffer curve. The more difficult and nuanced position of the Laffer curve is at 100% tax rate. How much revenue do you raise for the government? That's really a question that has baffled tax policy for quite some time, because even today, if you were to take a bill to Congress and get it in front of the Congressional Budget Office or in front of many state revenue estimating authorities, and if you said that we want to raise taxes to 100% marginal tax rate, the CBO has actually come back in D.C. and said it's going to raise like $16 trillion for the federal government. That's the fallacy that we operate under, unfortunately, when it comes to revenue scoring. Having a more realistic revenue scoring is a necessity, I think, going forward, both for the federal government and the states. But really, this has been a disparaged term. The Laffer curve has been talked about in very pejorative ways over time. I mean, it's been called voodoo economics, it's been called junk economics, but at the basic level, all the Laffer curve tries to present is at the 0% tax rate and the 100% tax rate level. You're not going to raise revenue for the government. Now, why is it at 100%? That's because obviously people don't work for the privilege of paying taxes. So the basic of the Laffer curve is that people do change their behavior based on incentives. Taxes are a very direct incentive for people to change their behavior. Now, with that being covered, I did want to mention briefly that there has been a little bit of a effort afoot by certain tax groups to say that taxes don't matter at the state level. Now, I think that hopefully anyone that is a taxpayer that has created a business and decides between competing jurisdictions and does the cash flow analysis on different marginal tax rates and how they affect the bottom line can dismiss that out of hand. However, some will say that weather is the only attributable factor that people are moving to the low tax states. They may say it's a coincidence that people are moving to places like Florida and Texas. It might be weather, it might be other reasons. Now, if you take that analysis, I just want to address that briefly. If you look at Hawaii, for instance, a place that I was at once and I never really wanted to leave, Hawaii has lost population 6 out of the last 10 years. In fact, Alaska has grown twice as fast as Hawaii has over the last 10 years. Also, California, the place of beautiful beaches, an amazing location that I really would love to go and live sometime if it wasn't for the high cost of living. California actually has lost 1.5 million Americans over the last 10 years that have decided to leave California and go to one of the other 49 states. Now, the ramifications of this is very clear. Now, obviously, every state has dealt with some redistricting issues recently. I imagine you're not exempt from that group. Now, California will, for the first time since statehood, 1850 roughly, will not gain a congressional seat in this round of redistricting. That is a consequence of California shedding that many Americans deciding to move to other states. Now, I ask you, what's changed about the beaches of California? Why people are deciding to leave California for the first time? Has the weather deteriorated? Are the beaches deteriorated? No. It's something that taxes have certainly got out of control, and the general business climate of California is something that, hopefully every state can hope not to emulate. I will mention one of the key findings from our research, our nonpartisan research and analysis of rich states, poor states, is as we're looking at the various tax policies for you as legislators to go forward and use. We obviously don't believe in zero government. We believe in a limited government that funds core services that your taxpayers desire and that your Constitution lays out. So how do you effectively go and fund those core services while extracting the least amount of damage from taxpayers and from the economy as possible? The Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation is an organization that studies the developed economies of the world. They recently came out with research that ranked the different tax forms, and in terms of forms of taxation, that is, corporate tax, individual tax, sales taxes, property taxes, as how damaging they were on economic growth in their analysis of the various international aspects. And what they found was the most damaging tax for economic growth is the corporate income tax, followed by the individual income tax, other taxes on capital, and then as you move down the spectrum, you get into the consumption taxes and other forms of taxation. This is not a ideological group whatsoever. This is a very much a fact-driven organization, and that's what they came up with at international level. Our research suggests that at the state level, that's also true. One of the analyses that we do in the Rich States, Poor States report analyzes the states without income taxes, compares those with the states that they have the highest marginal tax rates on personal income. And you can take that comparison. It also holds on corporate income taxes. And we compare those states over a 10-year period. We take a look at the states with the highest personal income taxes. They've had about 45% gross state product growth over the last 10 years. The states without income taxes, over 61% gross state product growth. Population growth, 6.5% population growth in the high income tax states, almost 14% population growth in the no income tax states. You look at total state tax receipt growth. This is somewhat counterintuitive because some would suggest that you need to have robust income taxes to raise revenue for government, but take a look. It's 62% tax receipt growth in the states with the highest personal income taxes, almost 124% tax receipt growth in the states without income taxes. Now, how is this possible? This is the Laffer curve effect in action when it comes to state tax policy, is that the sustainable way to create revenue for state government is to grow your tax base by attracting more taxpayers into your state rather than raising tax rates. Now, Texas has gained 4 congressional seats worth of new taxpayers in the last 10 years because of redistricting and population gains. They're not paying state income taxes, but they're paying state sales taxes, they're paying state property taxes and local property taxes and all the other taxes that fund government. And then job growth. This is something that has been on the front burner of every state legislator across the country in the last several years, is how do we get job growth moving again in our state? The states with the highest income taxes, less than 0.5% job growth over an entire decade. The states with the highest income tax rates, or with the no income tax, about 8% job growth through this very difficult business cycle. Now, I'm going to forego the formal PowerPoint here today, so we leave a little bit more time for question and answer with all of you, because I know you're probably very interested to hear what's going on in other states. And I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle when it comes to competitiveness. As I mentioned, you don't create policy changes in a vacuum. Dynamically, states are moving. They're moving very quickly. One of the things I wanted to mention is that, of course, we do a ranking in rich states, poor states on each state's economic outlook, and we measure it by 15 equally weighted factors that deal with taxes, regulation, and labor policy. And generally, Georgia has done quite well in our economic outlook ranking, thanks to the work of many of you on this committee and both of these committees. But I will say one thing, is that now in our 4th edition of the book, this is the first time that Georgia's economic outlook ranking has fallen outside the top 10 of the nation. You've just eased out of the top 10. You're number 11 now, but I think from a perspective of you've seen some deterioration. Now, it's not because you've been doing bad things on tax policy necessarily. It's because other states are actually taking more steps to become more competitive right now. And I think you've had took the big undertaking last year of talking about some pretty broad tax reform ideas. And I think other states have also taken that approach. Right now in the Midwest, we have 3 states. We have Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri, all considering eliminating their personal income taxes and moving to more of a consumption tax base for competitiveness reasons and for job creation reasons. And it'll be very interesting to see what type of progress they make throughout the year. But I will tell you one thing. I'm very certain that we will see significant income tax relief, even if they're not able to completely eliminate the income tax in those states. So with that, I think I would say the beauty of the American experiment that we have is that we have 50 very unique case studies, the 50 free trade zone that we have that the founders set up, that we can examine what's working and what's not working. And I think it's very clear. Taxpayers have displayed their preferences by voting with their feet. It's a concept we've talked about for 50 years in economics. They're voting very clearly towards the states without income taxes that have a less reliance on income taxes, and generally have a more pro-business framework. Because you can have the best education system, you can have the best roads in the country, but if you neglect the business climate overall, and if you allow other states to beat you in competitiveness, your well-educated graduates are going to go to other states for opportunities. And that was one of our big problems in Michigan. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to be back with you and address these committees, and I look forward to your questions.
Any members of the committee have any questions for Jonathan? It's an excellent opportunity. Majority Leader.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and I look forward to reading the latest edition. I'm very disappointed to learn that we have fallen to 11th. I'm curious on the psychological side of income tax impact. What are your thoughts on flat tax as opposed to a tax that's computed by lots of incentives and deductions, exemptions, that sort of thing, where you do sort of in the tax code pick winners and losers? If you had to be somewhat reliant on income tax, are you better off with a flat or a flatter tax, or are you better off trying to stay contemporary with business opportunities that some would lead us to believe?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and that's been a fundamental question among the states as to which path are we going to take towards competitiveness. And I think based on a few things that we've seen across the states, we come out on the side that a broad-based, low-rate tax system that is economically neutral, that does not pick winners and losers, that treats everyone by the same rules, that keeps taxes as low as possible. The key there, of course, is if you're going to have that type of a broad-based system, the rate needs to be low enough that it's going to allow people from any type of industry to come and do well within your state. If your rate is too high, then some of the incentive programs from other states may lure some of those companies away. We think that the long-term approach, though, of building this economically competitive environment with low taxes for everybody is based on the results that we've seen. States that take that approach are doing quite well. Even some of the academic work suggests that in the long run, states that take that approach of broad-based, low-rate tax systems, and that's based on academics for years, the economists across the political and ideological spectrum have said idealistically that's the way to do it, but it's psychologically speaking, I think that predictability, that's saying that we're going to have low rates and that we're going to have a predictable set tax system, that we're not going to change the rules of the game, we're not going to raise rates every time we have a budget problem, that's a very important fact as well. And I would mention one thing is that sometimes when you live by the sword, you die by the sword when it comes to incentives as well. As some states have taken that approach, and then they've been outbid by other states, and generally the companies, in many cases, that will move significant operations into a state for one incentive may a few years later decide that the grass is greener on the other side. But attracting companies that want to be there for the long term based on your predictable low rate policy, we found is the most successful approach.
Senator Ligon, did you have a question?
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, having no income tax rate would be great and is the best. But when you mention low, what is the range of what you consider a low tax rate?
Well, I think you'd be talking, if you were to look at the states that have the lowest broad-based flat taxes out there today, you'd be looking at a range of 3 to 4%. It would be considered a low tax for an income tax standard today.
Now follow up the question. And then are those states that have those rates, do they have a sales tax too, and what is the range of their sales tax?
Yes, generally they do have a sales tax as well, although there are some exceptions. Believe it or not, New Hampshire has neither an income tax nor a sales tax. And they've done that over the years because of their Yankee frugality, if you will, and their live free or die mentality, that They keep government limited to its core functions, and they're able to operate without either of those major taxes. But generally, you will have some sort of a sales tax component with the low income tax.
And now, may I follow up with one more question? What when you're looking at a sales tax, is there a range at a certain percentage when you start getting that too high and where it starts to have a detrimental effect on your economy, and what would that be?
Well, certainly that any tax that you're going to choose to raise revenue from is going to have a detrimental impact, because all taxes matter.
Right.
And I think when you look at the sales tax side, the median sales tax is going to be around 6%, I believe, today in the states. And so when you get significantly over that hurdle, I mean, you have certain states where they have the local add-ons like you have, and sometimes those localities can get up to the 9 or 10% range. Is not out of the ordinary. Now, let me say one thing though, is that if you were in a state, as I was recently in Tennessee, where I paid about 10% sales tax in Nashville. I also pay a 10% sales tax when I go out to eat in Washington, D.C. That's a 10%. Now the difference is, Tennessee doesn't have an income tax. Washington, D.C. does, one of the highest income taxes. So whatever form of revenue you take is going to extract some sort of economic price from your economy. I think just ordering it in terms of what's the biggest problem in terms of economic vitality extracted per dollar raised is the way probably to look at it.
Representative Martin.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for being here, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Address from me, following up on the senator's question, the border wars, if you will, between sales tax. I mean, it's different if we were talking about a national consumption tax in the United States, because we have certain trade barriers with Canada and with South America, and of course import-export. It's different, in the Leader O'Neill, when he chairs Ways and Means a number of years ago, we went around the state and heard from our border community. So if you could address the disparity if Georgia were to move toward a consumption-based tax to get away from the income tax, and also those portions of taxes that when our constituents deduct them, and I know what people are going to say when I say this, you can deduct state income tax from your federal income tax. I certainly know that that's spending $1 and only getting 15 to 28 cents back, but whatever that is, if one can collect revenue from the state of, for the state of Georgia on monies that are federally deductible, in fact, the federal government is paying a proportion of that tax for our citizens. It would be 15 to 28. How do states manage that? And certainly the federal situation is fluid, but can you kind of comment on how we would balance that so as not to push trade out of the state, and also to lean our tax system? For instance, we'd like to get away from ad valorem tax, but that happens to be one of the taxes that you can deduct from your federal. and state tax?
Yeah, those are both very good questions as well. And I would say that certainly that you're going to have some cross-border effects no matter what type of tax policy you choose. Right now, as I mentioned, in the Midwest, there's quite a battle going between Missouri and Kansas. Now, on that side of things, they're talking about the income tax elimination, and both of those states are seriously considering it. Now, it happens to be that there's a major metropolitan area located right on the border with being Kansas City, with a huge percentage of the population being on the Kansas side, but the downtown being on the Missouri side. And that's certainly some big implications there in terms of where businesses would choose to locate depending on what would happen on the income tax piece of it. Obviously, you're going to have a similar dynamic because people vote with their feet, they vote with their purchases, and if there's availabilities where it's, you can get a quality purchase on the other side of a border for quite a bit cheaper if you avoid a sales tax, that's certainly going to be a dynamic as well. I just think that you don't see quite as much in terms of some of the evidence that I've been exposed to at least suggests that most people will make a purchase within a certain mile radius of their living when it comes to groceries and other essentials that you're going to make on a weekly basis, let's say. And so for the examples that you do have a major metropolitan area right on a border, I think that could be an issue. But obviously now you have the issue of many people buying major purchases online as well, and you have that whole issue that probably could be a whole topic for another whole afternoon in terms of electronic commerce and sales taxation. But that is a very real concern. And with deductibility-wise, I think that that's something that you have to be also aware of. But if you do make major purchases, of course, I remember going through my taxes last year. It'll allow you to say, do you want to choose to take, if you've spent a certain percentage of your income over the year, they'll help you collect that information that you can take that deduction. It's usually not preferable if you do have an income tax, so it's usually the way you want to take it.
Majority Leader Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and hello to my good friend from Washington, D.C. Earlier you used the term Yankee frugality. I was just going to warn you, be careful with that first word. On a more serious note, I read the article last week in the Wall Street Journal about the competing states in the Midwest who all seem to be trending towards lowering significantly, or in some cases phasing out their income tax. What is the preferred model of doing that? I mean, we obviously operate in a balanced budget environment. We can't just wipe out 60% of our state's revenue all at one time. So there has to be a method of going from here to there. And what are they proposing?
Well, good to see you as well again. And I think that there's several approaches that they are looking at in those several states, Senator, and I think they're worthwhile taking a look at because, as you mentioned, the transition going cold turkey from a heavy income tax reliance to a consumption tax reliance is going to create some transition issues. And so what they've done to address those in several of those states, for instance, is the plans in, I can speak to Oklahoma and Tennessee specifically because they're a little bit more incremental in those states, where Missouri is a voter-led initiative on the ballot this fall that would have a little bit more of a dramatic transition to consumption tax status. Those other states, Kansas and Oklahoma, use the mechanism of basically using surplus dollars over time to buy down your income tax rates, but earmarking those dollars towards income tax reductions as the dollars become available. They're not looking to make draconian cuts to services. They're not looking to rapidly and extremely expand their sales tax in terms of revenue collected, but they are looking to, as revenue becomes available, to use that as more of a buy down towards more competitiveness. And one of the mechanisms that Kansas is looking at very seriously is taking a look in putting some sort of a growth limiting factor on the growth of state government, because when you talk about fiscal policy and tax reform in general, obviously talking about taxes without talking about the spending side is very difficult when you do live in a balanced budget requirement as you do. And so that's something they're taking a look at. They want to limit the growth of state spending to a certain metric that mirrors the private sector to make sure that spending doesn't go out of whack with the private sector. And quite frankly, that's been one of the major problems why states faced quite the shortfall that they did and they have over the last several years, is the research that we're using, that we're familiar with from George Mason University in Virginia, suggests that state spending grew 90% faster than the private sector over the last decade. And so unless we do something on the spending side, tax reform is going to be very difficult, and I think their approach of doing this incrementally through surplus dollars and limits on government growth is a very legitimate strategy.
Majority Leader O'Neill.
Thanks again. Sorry to keep bothering you, but you've said things that really are intriguing to me. Those states that you've been studying that are moving either rapidly or incrementally toward consumption away from income tax, what are they doing to undergird reliability or collectability of those taxes, with the premise that, you know, obviously consumption taxes are collected by private enterprise on a very trust basis, far more difficult to audit, as I'm told by revenue people. And if the nexus legal wars are lost, is there a way to rank, I suppose, what risk we might be taking? Let's say we're successful and we gravitate to consumption tax, and the proponents of nexus prevail, and since the federal government won't act, then all of a sudden we do have the electronic markets. I understand now that you can even have your groceries delivered electronically, avoiding any consumption tax. We have satellite providers of just about everything that escape every tax we have in Georgia, to the detriment of those that do invest and earn their livings in our state. So it becomes very much an equity issue. In your rankings, when these states move, is there a way to evaluate the risk? What if those cases get lost instead of won? And what are the states that are moving toward consumption doing to undergird the integrity of their ability to collect consumption taxes? That's the two simple questions I'm trying to.
No, those are both fascinating questions, and of course the issue of e-commerce and sales taxation has been one that's engulfed the discussion of state tax policy now for almost 15 years, since the streamlined sales tax movement started in the late 1990s, and of course with the Quill decision in the early 1990s that helped kind of set this off with the nexus wars, if you will. That's a good way of putting it, because it certainly is real. That is something that, moving towards a more consumption base, if states were able to reduce their reliance on income taxes, that you do need to strengthen up your base on your sales tax, because the rates cannot go above a certain level and still see a lot of commerce within your states, because you're going to increase the incentive to go other places if you get a rate, let's say, at 12 to 15%. I mean, that's not going to be sustainable at the state level. So states are looking to broaden their sales tax bases to, you've had this discussion in the last year, look at certain services. Now, the tricky thing is with service taxes, they're sometimes very unpopular when you start picking winners and losers there as well, which ones are going to continue to be exempt and which ones are going to be taxable. My home state of Michigan may be one of the worst examples of how to implement a service-based tax. It lasted a whole weekend before they repealed it. And what they did in Michigan was basically, the simple explanation was any industry that didn't have good lobbying presence at the state capitol was targeted and lost their sales tax exemption for services. And so what you need to do, of course, on services is you need to make sure you're not picking winners and losers in that whole debate as well. And if you making sure that you're taxing all final goods and services once at the retail level, that you avoid business-to-business taxation on business inputs, because no academic thinks that's a good idea. You can get that rate down. And I think that's the states that are moving away from the income tax base to more of a consumption tax base do have to help that tax base issue. As I mentioned, getting away from the idea of picking winners and losers through tax policy is very important to make sure people are playing by the same rules. And then I would, talk a little bit about the nexus issue. I don't want to go too much into depth onto that. That's been an issue that our organization has members on both sides of, as you can imagine. Gone through the years debating this. That's one of the issues where I do think at some level, obviously, based on physical presence right now. Let's say if you buy something on Home Depot's website or something, have it delivered in. If they have physical presence in your state, you're already going to be paying sales taxes on it if it's a internet purchase. It's the companies, of course, that don't have physical presence in the state that you wouldn't necessarily be required to pay, or they would not be required to collect. You'd be, required to pay the use tax, although the joke is, of course, the use tax has created more liars out of individuals than probably even golf. And so it's a tricky issue. I think probably you take a look at the transition on what's happening with Amazon right now, though, is their company's philosophy is changed on this topic a bit, and now they're supporting a federal solution to say that as their business model adjusts and evolves over time, and they're required to have more physical presence in warehouses to help their business network, they are having more legitimate physical presence in states. And so I think that there may be somewhat of a limiting factor there. As companies get larger, they do need to have more on-the-ground presence, but you're not going to solve that issue completely. But on predictability, I would mention one other thing when it comes to sales taxes that I neglected to mention is the sales tax base is inherently more predictable in terms of good budgeting. It makes it a whole lot easier for you to base your budget off of a sales tax consumption base than it does off of an income tax base, because income taxes are inherently very volatile sources of revenue. If you look at revenue collections over the last decade or over the last 2 or 3 decades, you see sales tax collections being relatively stable despite the business cycles that we go through. However, corporate and individual income tax revenue spike during good times, they plummet during bad times, and it leads to the boom and bust budgeting problems that states like California are going through right now.
Well, one question. In your research, how have you found that changes in tax policy have affected charitable giving in churches and 501c3 corporations that generally are good for our society and our way of life? Can you touch on that?
Well, absolutely. We do isolate that out as an important aspect of the social network that we have as a country, that we want to make sure that we induce that type of behavior. And one of the most dangerous things, I think, that comes against the charitable giving aspect that you mentioned there is what we've seen on the trend of certain states to try to target wealthy individuals through tax policy by setting up predatory brackets, if you will, for those individuals. One of the case studies that we actually talk about in this edition of the book, and in case it hasn't been made available, we'll make sure we make a copy available to you if you haven't had a chance to see it. New Jersey was one of those states that actually had a special bracket for millionaires in an attempt to, in a way, I guess, soak the rich. What they found was charitable giving plummeted because many wealthy individuals ended up leaving the state, moving to states with more hospitable treatment of their investment earnings or their ordinary wage earnings, and you saw an uptick in charitable giving in places without those type of taxes. I'll tell you the example. There was a study done by, I believe it was Princeton University, that analyzed this, and after New Jersey enacted their millionaire's tax in an attempt to soak the rich, they did see charitable giving have an appreciable decline. But also, anecdotally, there was a wealthy businessman, it was a hockey owner of the Buffalo Sabres. He was a New York resident. They also tried this type of a progressive tax the rich type scheme, and he left the state of New York after that was enacted. He moved to the state of Florida. In the process, he gave himself a 10% pay raise, roughly, because Florida is, of course, one of the states without income tax. And in the process, he was interviewed, and they were asked, why did you do this, and what are you going to do now? And it was a very interesting case study just from that one individual, and what kind of impact it has on public policy. Because he said, well, I'm moving my businesses here to Florida. I'm looking to start charity here in Florida. I'm not going to be doing that anymore in the upstate New York area where he was located. And at the end of the day, the state of New York was losing, last I checked, something like $13,000 a day in lost income tax receipts just because that one individual left and went to a state that was more hospitable. But it has a very direct relationship that we've seen on charitable giving as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Williams, I think I speak on behalf of this committee in expressing our gratitude for you coming here and listening and allowing us the benefit of your research. It's been an incredible vision for me, and I think others here. I just want you to know that it's unbelievably grateful. You're welcome in the state of Georgia anytime you're willing to come. And we're certainly anxious to listen to the outcomes of your studies. William and the church company have been very, very helpful. Very good. Colleagues, you want to close?
Well, again, Jonathan's a friend of mine, and I'm glad he was able to come join us today. And I think the research and the data that you bring forward is so important because we all get trapped in this notion that if we would just raise taxes, it would bring in more revenue, when in the reality, what's shocking about the data when you really look at it, those 9 states without an income tax bring in more revenue to the state at a faster rate than the states with the highest income taxes. So it is counterintuitive, but even if you're a big government progressive who wants to spend more government money, having a lower income tax rate actually helps you do that. And I'm not suggesting I'm that way at all, but it just shows that low tax rates equal economic growth, which is the only answer to getting out of the problems we're in.